Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the Musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference. Our theme on today's musical Innertube is collapse and resilience. Why do some civilizations collapse when crisis comes and never come back? And why do others survive and come through sometimes better than before or sometimes not? Here today to discuss all that and more is Eric H. Cline, Professor of Classical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies and of Anthropology at George Washington University and Director of GWU's Capitol Archaeological Institute. He published 1177 BC, an influential and still controversial meditation on one of the biggest mysteries in archaic history. Why did so many of the major civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean crash within a couple of decades of 1200 BC? In about a month, Professor Cline is coming out with not one, but two new books after 1177 BC, in which he studies how civilizations survived that collapse. And to celebrate the 10th birthday of the original 1177 BC book, he's publishing a graphic novel version, which I have to say is terrific work, making a great deal of information accessible and even fun to absorb. Welcome to our podcast, Eric Cline.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be on. Thank you.
I think we can't talk about your new books without spending just a couple of minutes on 1177 BC. I can't believe it's 10 years old already, and that's a long time in archaeological practice. People have been digging a lot since then. Have anything happened in the last 10 years to add to what you've been saying in that original book?
Yes. A lot happened. In fact, yesterday was exactly the 10th anniversary of when I held the very first copy of the book in my hands. Thanks to Facebook, they had that memory. I'm like, wow. So, yes, what happened was so much new information came out after 2014 that I asked the press if I could put out a revised edition. And they agreed. And in 2021, the revised and expanded edition came out with a lot more data. There had been all kinds of mostly climate change related studies that had come out. And fortunately for me, all the new data corroborated what I had said, which was good. But I wanted to put it in. And so it's up to date as of 2021. And then now we're up to the sequel, which will come out, 10 years after.
I noticed in one of the talks that you gave on YouTube that I managed to catch, that you went through sort of a checklist of the things that contributed to the downfall of all those civilizations from Egypt all the way around through Turkey and Greece. And the checklist did indeed kind of match some of the stuff that's happening now. Can you, briefly, from what you remember, go through that checklist and compare it to what's happening to our particular civilization right now?
Oh, yeah. So the checklist, if I remember correctly, was something like, do we have climate change today? Yes. Do we have droughts? Do we have famines? Check. Earthquakes? Check. Do we have refugees fleeing from civil wars and such? Check. And I think at that time I said we have everything except for sea peoples. And I said, and even that we've got now because we've got mass migrations. And the one thing that was missing from that list that I didn't even bother saying, check, was disease. But guess what? We can add disease to that now, I think. Yes. So I'm actually even more worried than I was back then that we're heading down the same road.
And I think that anyone who wants a wake-up call should read the last chapter of After 1177 BC, where you take a fairly dry-eyed look at where we are, when you look at us, obviously a lot of the time people don't know that their civilization is collapsing when it's collapsing. So I'm wondering, when you look at us, do we show any signs of resilience? Do we show that maybe we have the resources to hang on through whatever's coming?
Well, I would say that's actually a couple of different questions right there. So,
Please.
yes, I do think we have the resources and we have the resilience. The question is going to be, are we sane enough to actually put that into place? And I remember I was interviewed by Adam Frank on NPR right after the first book came out. And I had said, all kind of cocky and proud, unlike the Hittites who didn't know what happened to them, we're well aware that we have, climate change and drought and famine. And Adam just paused and said, yes, but are we smart enough to do anything about it? And I didn't have an answer for that one. So I do think we have the resources. I do think we're resilient. Whether we're going to apply them in time is a totally different question.
Now, looking at the first book, 1177, we see a lot of the people that are now in the news for doing pretty much the same thing. Syria was part of that. The area that is now Palestine and Israel were part of that. Egypt was part of that. Turkey was part of that. That area is still hundreds of thousands of years later, front and center in this boiling conflict. So what does that tell you after all these centuries have gone by, that area is still not settled?
Yeah, well, you're right. History is, I wouldn't say repeating itself, but as Mark Twain said, it does rhyme. And we've definitely got that over and over and over again. I had already noted something like that back in some previous books that people weren't reading what I was writing yet, really. But I had written a book on the battles of Armageddon, all the battles that had been fought at Megiddo. And I had another book called Jerusalem Besieged, from ancient Canaan to modern Israel. And in both books, I looked at the battles from antiquity until today, and I said, the only thing that has changed are the type of weapons that are being used and the people who are actually fighting. But, they're still fighting there, and they probably always will. So same type of thing here with 1177 and the collapse and onward. Yeah, this is, the ancient Mediterranean from the west to the east has always been kind of this globalized, localized area. And they just seem to be doing the same things again and again. But the players change. You get, this rise and fall of empires, right? So you've, even in the first millennium, Neo-Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, again, the names change, but everything else kind of stays the same. So I do see things repeating, shall we say. We've got the same things around now that they had back then.
So in after 1177 BC, one of the most fascinating things that you do in a very fascinating book is that you rank the civilizations according to their ability to be resilient and to come through. And there are some surprises, I think, to some people. Egypt does keep going, but it's never the same, really, except for maybe one pharaoh, right? Shoshank. And except for that guy, really, it's never the same after the collapse. So in a way, it doesn't get to be in the first rank of resilient civilizations. It sort of welters in the middle somewhere. But we do have very successful civilizations that hang on. The Babylonians do. And you're really a fan of the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, which we'll talk about in a minute. And one of the very entertaining surprises in your book is that the Israelites may have actually benefited from the collapse of situations around them, right? That other situations ran into a brick wall and sort of fell apart. And you have the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and they sort of I wouldn't say rush in, but they sort of fill a gap. They sort of prosper in the midst of collapse. Can you talk about that story a little bit more? Because it really has affected us, because we are the inheritors of Israelite civilization to a great degree.
Yeah, what we find in these centuries after the collapse, which, a lot of people have called it the Dark Ages, and I'm at pains to say it's not a dark age. Anytime when you have the standardization of the alphabet and the proliferation of iron, this is not a dark age. What it is an age of innovation. And along the lines of what you were just referring to, there is a power vacuum. That's probably the best way to put it. When the large empires of the late Bronze Age collapse, like the Hittites, for example, and even the Egyptians, as you say in my table ranking the success of the people. I'm going to get some pushback on that table, by the way. Some of
when
my
I was
colleagues,
looking at it, I thought of people saying the Babylonians should be first. I don't like the Phoenicians number one. No. It could be. I could see it's almost made for table talk. Let's put it that way.
and this is where I am expecting it, which is it's going to be fun. I'm actually expecting a discussion pushback from my colleagues who are going to say, "Wait a minute, you've got the Mycenaeans and the penultimately from the bottom. They're not at the top." But anyway, so there's a power vacuum. The Egyptians withdraw from Canaan, right? They retreat back to their own borders, shall we say. And you're right, they do kind of manage to muddle on the Egyptians, but I've got 5 categories, with one being the top, and that's where the Phoenicians and Cypriots are, and 5 being the bottom, which is where the Hittites are. The Egyptians come in third, so they're not even second, they're third. I mean, at one point in these centuries after the collapse, at one point, there are no fewer than 4 different people all saying they're Pharaoh at the same time, and they're ruling different parts of Egypt. But anyway, but back to Israel and Judah, what happens is that there is then a power vacuum in Canaan, and that is when we see the Israelites taking over. The big question is, and I'm not going to resolve this because it's an ongoing discussion, is at what point did the Israelites come into the area, and how were they able to take over? So this is where we get into questions like, when did the Exodus take place? And when is the Israelite conquest of Canaan? And how did it go? You've got 2 different versions in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. Is it a genocide, or are they assimilating the local Canaanites and living side by side? Depends which book in the Bible you're reading at the time. But nevertheless, with the withdrawal of everybody else, that opens the door for the Israelites to settle down, whether they come down from the highlands or wherever, and we get the beginnings of Israel and Judah. What we have to realize is that they're not the only ones. We also get the kingdoms of Moab and Edom and Ammon. All these little smaller kingdoms flourish once they're out from under the shadow of the big empires, or are allowed to grow because the empires aren't there anymore. But that's also where the climate change comes in, because there's some new evidence that the drought, which had been continuing, may have lifted for a little bit, 11th century, 10th century, thereby allowing these new kingdoms to put down roots and to flourish. And that's one of the things I talk about in After 1177. So climate change, was both bad, that was, the collapse, but also may have helped revitalize things. So it's an ongoing process. But I found it fascinating, and I hope the readers do too. It's a really interesting period, what happens after the collapse.
I love the point that you make that climate change might be involved in how Canaan was nicknamed the land of milk and honey. And, the discovery of beekeeping happens not too, it's it's right in there, that
Right.
beekeeping becomes an industry. And if it's the land of milk, that means there must have been raising of cattle. You must have had grass. You must have had a fairly, and the climate is supposed to have been pretty nice then for a while anyway.
When it came back, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and not necessarily grass, but grain for sure. And we do know
Sure.
From the studies that Israel Finkelstein and others have done that the Egyptians were crossbreeding cattle while the collapse was happening to get more drought-resistant cattle. So, you've got milk and honey, and they have found beehives at Tel Rehov from this period.
Yes.
I mean, again, absolutely fascinating.
In the After 1177 book, you do bring in a couple of tables later in the book from current climate change studies and apply them to what's been found in the archaeological digs of that area. So how did those two match? How did that work out?
So that was kind of fun, and I realized that this is the hook for the book in a way at the end. I was collecting all of this data. I was writing all of the chapters, and in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, wow, this sounds like today. This sounds like today. Why does this sound like today? And then at one point across my desktop came the most recent report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Right.
The ones that every year say, oh my God, the sky is falling. And I thought, wow, that's what I'm looking for. And I downloaded their most recent report because it's all open access. And I'm leafing through it. And I'm like, this is exactly what has happened back then. And then I went back to a couple of earlier studies. And in fact, when I was out, I spent part of the time writing the book out at the Getty on a fellowship. And while I was there, I met a fellow who does this for a living, working on the modern stuff, and had a couple of lunches with him and ran this idea by him. And I'm like, you guys, specifically, there's a report came out in 2012. I said, you give great definitions for resilience, for transformation, for adaptation, for coping. And it's quite different if you have a society that transforms versus one that adapts versus one that just copes. Coping, you're living for the moment. Adapting, you're living for next week. Transforming, you're living for next year or so. And so I think this works. And so I tried to adapt it. And that's where I came up with these tables. And that's where I came up with the Egyptians are in third place and Cypriots in first place. But I do ask the question of, is this a problem that I'm being anachronistic, that I'm using modern day terms and definitions and applying them to the ancient world where they might not be appropriate? And then I thought, no, I think it's appropriate. But that's another area where I think we're going to have some good discussions when the book comes out, with including people saying this isn't appropriate to use these, or others saying, yes, it is appropriate, but I disagree. I think, the Egyptians actually did transform, and you think they merely coped. And that's where we'll get some
Terrific.
good, nice, we'll get some nice knockdown, drag-out fights at the scholarly meetings, which are always fun.
Yeah, scientific fights are always the best.
The territory is so small, so the fights are so
Fighting
big.
is harder, yeah.
Yes.
Very intense.
So one of the points that you make is that during what used to be called the Dark Ages, and I, for one, am glad that that's not being used anymore. I hope it isn't anyway. The Greeks lost literacy for a couple of centuries. Mm-hmm. And then they got it back. As you mentioned, there were a couple of dozen of alternative alphabets out there, and abjabs and other kinds of ways of writing. And then it settled down to one after a little while. And within a couple of centuries of that, you have the Iliad and the Odyssey. You have a flourishing, dynamic literary culture, which we still possess. Well, 0.1% of, but still, it's been incredibly formative. Now you have the Israelites who called themselves latterly people of the word, meaning that they used writing also. It does seem that writing is very potent, that it's, if it's preserved, if it's remembered, if it's passed on, it seems as though of all the innovations this side of iron, which is what the people on Cyprus specialized in, that's an innovation that really made a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And the alphabet at this point is standardized. I mean, I just heard a lecture the other night by my colleague Chris Ralston and some other colleagues, that the alphabet may go back actually all the way back to about the 18th century BC. But what the Phoenicians do after the collapse of the Bronze Age is to standardize it and then spread it from there. And so from the Phoenician alphabet, we get the Greek alphabet and we get the Latin alphabet. And of course, we're still using the Latin alphabet today. That's English, French, German, Italian, all of the Romance languages all use the Latin alphabet. And you can actually trace most of the other writing systems also back to about that time period. And in the conversations that I've had with those specialists, they keep pointing out that standardizing the alphabet meant that it could spread to everybody. It was, democratic small d, because it's much easier to learn how to read and write using this 26-letter alphabet or so, than it is to memorize Egyptian hieroglyphics or Akkadian, Babylonian, Hittite using cuneiform. And so with Egyptian and cuneiform, maybe 1% of the people could read or write, and the scribes had a very exalted position. Now with this alphabet, pretty much anybody could do it. And so one of the things that I find fascinating is the question of how exactly did it spread? One scholar thinks that it was just the sailors in the ports at the inns and bars and saying, wait, I need to make a note of this. Oh, I have a new way of writing. Here, let me teach you how to do it. It'll take 10 minutes. And I think that person said that the alphabet could have spread like in 3 weeks across the country, which I think might be a bit of an exaggeration. But and it is true, as you referred to, that there at one point, there were something like 33 different variations of the Greek alphabet before they settled on the one that came into use. The big discussion these days is, when did this happen? People had always said, it's in about the 8th century BC, because you need it by the time of Homer, Hesiod, Sappho, and the other early Greek poets who are, late 8th, early 7th century. So the alphabet had to be around, even though, of course, Homer's not writing stuff down. It gets written down even later than him. But the newest thinking and suggestions is that the alphabet may have come across as early as the 11th century, which is when the Phoenicians first start spreading out across the Mediterranean. And I like that very much because that would give you time to get like 33 different variations, but it would also mirror the way that the changes are over in the Near East, like you said, like in Israel and those areas. That way, Greece is developing at the same time as the Near East is developing in this new writing system, as opposed to Greece being 300 years behind, which I don't find plausible. So it's a minority of scholars now that are saying that the alphabet spread as early as the 11th century, which would have been right after the collapse. But I think it makes sense. So as you pointed out, in Greece, they lose the art of writing, linear B to be specific, which is what they're using in the Mycenaean palaces, which is the accounting system. And again, this is one of those complicated pictographic where 1% of the people could do it. But if they then switch to the alphabet within 100 years, that's not that long a time. And
yes,
for me, at least, it makes a lot of sense. So, but the alphabet really did democratize in terms of everybody being able to read and write. Was a major leap forward. Yeah.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment, but first, here's a soothing musical interlude. For more than 30 years, Eric Cline has studied the civilizations of the Mediterranean world in ancient times. His books include Sailing the Wine Dark Sea, International Trade and the Late Bronze Age Aegean, and From Eden to Exile, Unraveling Mysteries of the Bible.
Other titles include The Trojan War, a very short introduction, and Digging Up Armageddon, the search for the lost city of Solomon. For more on Eric H. Cline, check out his website at cnelc.columbian, columbian.gwu.edu/Eric-H-Cline.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress. In the first book, 1177, you make the point that one of the ways that we can establish that we had empires and a lot of activity going on is the trade. When you do the excavations, you find pottery and other examples of things that couldn't have come from that area, that had to come from another area, establishing trade. Then when you go into the recovery period in your second book, you're talking about the Phoenicians being probably the biggest bounce back civilization. And part of that is because they kept the trade going. They were the ones that went out, and as far as the Western Mediterranean, they were way out there towards Spain doing their trading and that sort of thing. So I'm assuming the trade between nations, between peoples, is one of the driving factors in keeping civilization going.
Yes, it is. We do see a drop-off right at the collapse. The globalized, interconnected network is what breaks apart, and then the societies have to deal with things. But you're quite right that it is the reestablishment of trade that is going to drive the path to success for those who are able to come back. And by the 8th century, we've got that network back in place, and that's what I was trying to go from one to the other. But yes, the Phoenicians in particular, talk about a power vacuum. They take advantage of the fact that the site of Ugarit in what is now North Syria, that Ugarit is, torched to the ground and not re-inhabited for a couple of hundred years. And Ugarit had been one of the major players in terms of the Mediterranean trade. Phoenicians step right in and take over, as do the Cypriots. And that's in part why they're up in my number one category, because they do transform. In fact, the Phoenicians in particular, are what Nassim Nicholas Taleb has called anti-fragile. They flourish in the time of chaos. And the Phoenicians, for me, are the epitome of anti-fragile. So, yes, the trade really does drive everything. And in fact, we know, the Phoenicians are famous for the purple dye as well. Yes. They're spreading the purple dye. But we now know there's also trade back and forth. You mentioned Spain. They're going all the way to Spain to bring back silver, for example. And we're finding, silver from Iberia, ancient Spain, in the region of Phoenicia and in Israel and Judah. So they really are going to, I wouldn't say to the ends of the earth, but certainly over to the Western Mediterranean and then as far as Spain already by the time we're in the middle of this Iron Age, which again is why it's not a dark age.
Right. One thing I noticed is that the Italic Peninsula doesn't have much of a role in what we're talking about. It may be a little bit out of our ambit to talk about it, but I'm wondering, was it not involved in the collapse? Obviously, this is way before Rome, of course, but I wonder if we have any intimations that similar ferment was happening there.
Yes, we do, and there's much more work that's being done even as we speak there. There's now evidence that there was a drought in northern Italy round about 1200 BC that may have actually been the motivation for the Sea Peoples to begin their migration from that region. There's evidence there might have been upwards of 100,000 people that started leaving at about 1200 BC. But we also get then new developments there that they start to bounce back in the Iron Age as well. And that is an area, I would say, that's ripe for more exploration. There's a lot of work already being done there, but the connections between, say, Italy and Crete, and especially Cyprus, right? If you got not only Italy, but also like Sardinia, you've got copper in Sardinia, you've got copper in Cyprus, and they're actually sending it both ways. And it really does look like things do continue. So yes, we have to factor in the Italic people into this whole equation. But things do change. I mean, I just mentioned copper. There's a new source starting in about the 10th century, which is in what we would call modern-day Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula. The Wadi Fainun, they start exploiting the copper mines there by 11th, 10th centuries. And we actually find copper from that region in bronze big cauldrons at the site of Olympia in Greece by the 8th century. So, there are new players and new sources of copper, but also bear in mind, as they're switching to iron, of course, iron ore is found in every single country pretty much. And so it's kind of like the alphabet in a way. Once you master the technique of manufacturing iron, of smelting it and all that, almost anybody could do it, as opposed to copper, which was a little bit more difficult with the copper and the tin to make the bronze, right?
Sure.
So you get, again, these new inventions that are available to everyone, not just to the elite, and that I think is what is going to set the stage for the next phase, when you start getting things like democracy in Greece, when we get down into the 6th and the 5th centuries into the next stage.
And something else that occurred to me in your first book in 1177, when you go back to look at the ruins of some of these cities, sometimes the ruins are showing a major building burned out, but the rest of the city was not burned, which suggests possible rebellion on the part of people who were not the haves, the have-nots, which again triggered in my mind January 6th, that sort of thing. And is that definitely one of the things that you think contributed to the collapse, and something that possibly,
yes,
in a rebellion?
Yes, I do think it's one of the definite possibilities. I mean, I do consider that in 1177, yes, that internal rebellion, the 99% rising up against the 1%, is a definite possibility, especially if you've got drought and famine and disease. And when you have, as you said, when you have one major building burnt, but the rest of them still standing, to some archaeologists, that would suggest rebellion by the lower class. We do have to keep in mind, though, and some other archaeologists have been at pains to point this out, that, one person's destruction is another person's, oh my gosh, the cow kicked the lantern over, in Chicago type of thing. And so there is some debate about just how destructive are these destructions, and are we correct in how we are interpreting them? And are they Mother Nature versus invaders versus all of that? And that's fine. That's all open to discussion. What I would say is, no matter what, the larger overall picture is that we do get this catastrophe of everything just kind of collapsing. But yeah, I think just because you have a destruction at a site doesn't necessarily mean that it was absolutely the worst, that you've got an invader and this and that. It might have been an earthquake. It might have been a local rebellion. I mean, they're all pretty bad, right? But we're talking levels of destruction here.
So these books that you have written are written so that everyone can read them. They are in the spirit, the democratic spirit of the alphabet, in that sense, is that you seem throughout your career to be sure that archaeology gets out to as wide an audience as wants to know about it, you've written these short introductions to the Trojan War, to biblical history, to archaeology itself. And now we have this amazing animal, a graphic novel version of 1177. And I believe your artist is Glynis Fawkes, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, if I can riff on that for just a bit.
Please, it's so much fun, by the way. I got to say that. It is so much fun.
It really is fun. Yeah. It absolutely is fun. And that's why I do it. I mean, I love this. I wanted to be an archaeologist since the age of 7 when my mother gave me a book on Troy. And I said, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And, here we go. So what I've tried to do throughout my career is bring that love and that compassion not compassion, but passion to the general public. And just say, here's why I love it. Here's why I think it's so interesting. I mean, I think the Bronze Age is one of the most interesting periods of history. But I realize, too, that like any profession, we have our jargon. We have our insider terminology, which just doesn't come across. So what I've been trying to do in what I write for the general public is I write as if my wife's grandmother is going to be reading it. She was wonderful. Before she passed away, she would, call me up having watched something on TV and just say, Eric, they found the Ark of the Covenant. And I would say, again? And she would say, yeah. And so anyway, she was the epitome of the intelligent, learned, interested, general reader who doesn't know who to believe and really just wants to find out. So I've aimed everything as if my wife's grandmother was reading it. So, but that is still one step away from this marvelous graphic version. So you just mentioned Glynis Fawkes. She is amazingly talented. She's both a cartoonist and an archaeologist.
Wow.
And so she had a Fulbright to Cyprus. She's in the cartooning industry. I mean, you can take online courses from her. She's got a number of other graphic books. But what she has done is essentially translated. She's translated 1177 BC into another language, right? I mean, it's in German and French and Italian and Spanish. Now it's in cartoon.
Yes.
now it's in graphic.
Right.
And what she did, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, first of all, the drawings are marvelous. They're just super fantastic. But she also took all of my verbiage, went on for 110,000 words, and she's only used about 20% of it because what she did is take an entire paragraph and say, I can boil this down to 6 words. And there they are in the bubble. And she did such a marvelous job that the whole book is in there in this language. So, but it's also, the drawings are beautiful. We introduced 2 new characters, 2 young kids. There's a guy named Pell, who's about 12 years old. Pell is short for Peleset, which is one of the sea peoples. And the other, his companion, is a young lady named Shisha, who's an Egyptian, and she can read and write. She's a scribe, and she always makes fun of Pell because he can't read or write. He's illiterate. And the 2 of them run around the Mediterranean visiting all the civilizations, trying to figure out why they're collapsing. And the other thing that we did, and we did this very late in the production, we realized there were certain things that they couldn't have known, but that the reader needs to know. And so Glynis and I dropped down in occasion, like, where's Waldo? And you can see me in the corner.
That's right.
And I'm like in the corner, and I'm saying to Glynis, the kids don't know this, but what we think now is this. And that way, the reader is able. So there's 4 new characters. I think it really works. And it's huge. It's big. It's thick. It's oversized, and it's incredibly colorful. When I got an advanced copy the other day, and I opened it up, I said, this is beyond my expectations. This is amazing. I said, whoever buys this is going to get their money's worth. And I'm hoping that it reaches a whole new audience, because not only now would kids 7 to 17 read it, but I'm hoping we get new readers up to the age of 70, 80, including people who don't usually like to read books. This is not like reading a book. This is like sitting around leafing through a comic book. So I'm so excited for the graphic version to come out. And and Princeton had decided we don't want to put out one and then the other and have them trump each other. So they're going to appear on the exact same day. So the sequel, after 1177, and the graphic version of the original are both coming out on April 16th. So we're going to have a major book launch party, I guess you would say. But yeah, I think in terms of bringing this to the general public, this is one thing we hadn't done before. But the graphic version, I think I'm hoping it hits a whole nother market segment, and the only thing after that is to see if we can get a Saturday morning cartoon series,
The other thing I noticed about it, too, is that whereas you do have quotes from the people of antiquity, and some of it is in their stilted language, but that's highlighted, and there's always the characters on the outside explaining what it means. And then when you have some of the actual characters from antiquity, some Egyptians and that sort of thing, and you have them speaking in colloquial. For example, an Egyptian is threatened and he goes, "I'm getting out of here." And that's exactly what's in the book and what's in the word balloon. So again, there's an accessibility to it that would probably introduce people who never thought they'd read anything about archaeology, introduce it to them very gently and very nicely.
That's what I'm hoping. And some people will be able to, there are some really funny lines, very dry humor. And you're reading, you're like, seriously? And I told Glynis that, I was reading through the proofs and all that. I said, I was just cracking up and, I'm in hysterics. It's really funny if you're prepared to interject some humor in there. It's there. So yeah, I think people are going to like it.
I will say that in the graphic novel, you're sporting a really nice baseball cap. Let me tell you that.
Yeah. This is true. Well, what she did is she took photographs of us. And that's where it comes from. That is a real picture of me at Megiddo, and then she made a caricature of it. But and even the sunglasses dangling, that's in the original picture too. So yeah, it's fun. I do hope that the kids play Where's Waldo and go through and how many times do you see Cline? Oh, I got 58.
A new game.
Where's Eric?
Yeah, well. I used to play with remember the Richard Scarry books or Richard Scarry books, right? So we used to play that. And then with the Dr. Seuss and Go Dog Go, how many blue dogs do you see? How many green dogs? I'm hoping the kids, even the ones that can't read, will just leaf through it and do something like that. But we'll see.
Well, folks, we've been talking about 3 books, really. So we'll just say that the 2 new books that are coming out are 1177 BC, a graphic history of the collapse of civilizations in the Bronze Age, and on the same day, after 1177, a prose book. And all are by Eric H. Cline, our guest today. We hope you pick them up because they repay reading and rereading. And Don and I have both had a great time in different ways with the 2 books. We want to thank you for coming on our show today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.